The Undelivered Letter, An American Tale. In the charming town of Willow Bend, where wide streets are framed by century-old oak trees, and where neighbors still chat over picket fences, lived a young woman named Emily Summers. She was in her early 20s, with wavy chestnut hair that fell just below her shoulders and inquisitive hazel eyes that sparkled whenever she stumbled upon a good mystery. Emily had recently graduated from college and found herself at a crossroads, unsure of her next steps. She moved back to Willow Bend temporarily to help manage her late grandmother's estate, a quaint white house at the end of Maplewood Lane that held as many secrets as it did memories. Discovering the letter. On a late summer afternoon, when the cicadas hummed lazily in the trees and the humid air clung to every surface, Emily was in the midst of cleaning out the attic. The space was dimly lit by a single dusty window. Stacks of boxes were pushed against the walls, some filled with old photo albums, others brimming with vintage hats and dresses that had once belonged to her grandmother. As Emily shifted a cracked trunk aside, she noticed a loose wooden board in the far corner. It seemed slightly ajar, like it was hiding something. Curiosity sparked inside her. She pried the board away and was surprised to see a small alcove behind it, just big enough to store a few documents. There, she found a faded envelope with a stamp that looked decades old. The postmark was dated 1986, but it had never been cancelled, suggesting it was never actually mailed. Written on the envelope in elegant cursive were only 2 words, "My love." Emily's heart fluttered. She'd always been drawn to stories, whether in books, films, or whispered family lore, and here she was, potentially unearthing her own. She turned the envelope over and noticed a no-return address, just the initials Dr. scrawled in the corner. With trembling fingers, she carefully opened it. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, the ink slightly smudged by the passing of time. It was a love letter, filled with heartfelt yearning and a sense of urgency. Someone named David was pouring out his soul to a woman named Maria, confessing a devotion that seemed to have gone unspoken for far too long. The final words struck Emily the hardest. "I don't know if we'll ever have the life we dreamed of, but I refuse to give up until I've told you these words in person." A family clue. Though shaken by the emotion in the letter, Emily's immediate question was, how did it end up hidden in her grandmother's attic? She knew her grandmother, Helen Summers, had always been a generous soul who often let friends or distant relatives stay in her home whenever they needed a place of refuge. Perhaps David had once sought shelter under that roof and placed the letter in the alcove for safekeeping. That evening, Emily sat in the living room, flipping through old photo albums in the hopes of stumbling upon a clue. The living room was cozy, lit by a warm lamp that cast gentle shadows on the floral wallpaper. She found pictures of holiday dinners, family reunions, and neighborly get-togethers. Yet, she saw no mention of anyone named David or Maria. Frustrated but not defeated, she decided to reach out to her parents, who lived 2 states away. On a video call later that night, her mother, Karen Summers, furrowed her brow at the mention of the letter. "I vaguely remember Grandma Helen hosting a young man for a few weeks in the late 80s, Karen mused. "His name might have been David, but I'm not sure. He was having some trouble at home, I think." Emily felt a jolt of excitement. "Do you know anything else? Did Grandma ever mention what happened to him?" Karen shook her head. "No, honey. It was a long time ago. But you might ask Mr. Hathaway down the street. He was close to your grandmother and has lived in Willow Bend for over 50 years. If anyone remembers David, it's him." Mr. Hathaway's recollection. The next morning, Emily walked a few houses down to the tidy home of Thomas Hathaway, an older gentleman with sharp green eyes that still held a youthful twinkle. He greeted Emily with a kind smile, offered her a glass of iced tea, and invited her to sit on the porch. Sunlight filtered through the tall oaks, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the summer breeze. When Emily mentioned the letter and the name David, Thomas's expression grew distant. He gazed out at the street, as though searching his memories for something nearly forgotten. "David Reed," he finally said, nodding. "Yes, that was his name. He was about 19 or 20 when I first met him, tall, gangly kid with warm brown eyes. He wrote poetry if I recall correctly. Guess you could say he was quiet, but his words carried a lot of emotion." Emily, clutching her notebook, jotted down every detail. "Why was he staying with my grandmother?" Thomas cleared his throat. "From what Helen told me, David's parents had a falling out with him. He was dating a girl from another town, and his father was furious that David was planning to leave home and maybe marry her. Eventually, David had no place to go, so your grandmother gave him a room for a short while." Maria's mystery. The next question Emily posed involved the other name, Maria. Mr. Hathaway's brow wrinkled. "I remember David was absolutely smitten with a young woman named Maria Brooks," he said slowly. "She would visit every now and then, but only when her family thought she was somewhere else. I think she was dealing with her own troubles, maybe her parents disapproved of David, or she had obligations that kept her from seeing him openly." "Do you know what happened to them?" Emily asked, hope flickering in her eyes. Thomas sighed. "Not exactly. One day, they both vanished. Word was that David intended to leave Willow Bend to find work in a bigger city, maybe Chicago or St. Louis. But then Maria disappeared, and no one was sure if she went with him or if they parted ways. Helen always suspected they were prevented from following through on their plans. The reason the letter remained. That evening, Emily returned to the attic, imagining David pacing the creaky floors, torn between fear and love, writing that heartfelt confession to Maria. She could almost sense the tension in the air from decades ago. Perhaps David intended to send the letter once he knew Maria's new address, or maybe he was too afraid it would fall into the wrong hands. For reasons unknown, the letter remained hidden, its words unread. But something in its plea, "I refuse to give up until I've told you these words in person," stirred Emily's heart. She felt compelled to finish what had been left undone. She wanted to see if there was any chance David and Maria could connect, even all these years later. The search begins. Determined, Emily started her detective work. She spent hours at the local library, combing through old newspapers on microfilm. She searched for wedding announcements, job postings, or any mention of David Reed or Maria Brooks. She found a small classified advertisement from 1986. Someone named D. Reed was selling a guitar before moving out of town. Another page mentioned a local poetry contest winner, also named David Reed. Eventually, she stumbled onto a short article about a car accident on the outskirts of Willow Bend in 1987. Among the injured was a young woman named Maria Brooks. The article mentioned she was taken to a hospital in Glenville, a nearby town. Emily's pulse quickened. This was a potential lead, though it was unclear whether that accident led Maria to vanish or if it was unrelated. A visit to Glenville. Early the next morning, Emily drove the hour-long route to Glenville. The highway cut through rolling farmland, patches of tall corn swaying in the breeze. Upon arriving, she visited the local archives in the hopes of finding hospital records or newspaper follow-ups. Privacy laws prevented her from accessing much, but she did manage to locate an old phone directory from the late 80s. Listed there was a Brooks, Harold and Linda, presumably Maria's parents. She jotted down the address, though it was no guarantee they still lived there. When she arrived at the address, a small, neatly kept brick house, an elderly woman answered the door. She introduced herself as Linda Brooks. She had a gentle voice and eyes that had clearly witnessed the passage of many years. After hearing Emily's cautious explanation about why she was there, Linda invited her inside, curiosity piqued. Learning about Maria. Sitting in a cozy living room adorned with family portraits, Emily soon realized that Linda was indeed Maria's mother. Although initially guarded, Linda opened up when she understood the sincerity behind Emily's visit. She recounted how Maria had once been head over heels for a young man named David Reed, but Linda and her husband disapproved because they thought David lacked stability. When Maria turned 19, tension grew to a breaking point. Maria wanted to leave with David, but on the day of their planned departure, she was involved in that car accident. Terrified for their daughter's future, Linda and her husband convinced Maria that David's life on the road was too uncertain. During her recovery, Maria moved in with relatives in Michigan. She never really spoke of David after that, Linda whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. I think she was heartbroken, but she tried to move on. She married someone else a few years later, but that didn't last either. Where is David? With Linda's help, Emily gleaned the last known city David had moved to, Cedar Grove, about 3 hours northwest of Willow Bend. She gave Emily a worn postcard Maria had once received, an image of Cedar Grove's main street, with a note from David simply saying, "I'm sorry. I hope you're all right." And so Emily ventured on yet another road trip. Her car rumbled along interstate highways that cut through fields of sunflowers and old barns. Along the way, she replayed the letter in her mind, pondering how love could go astray so easily, and how sometimes fate seemed to intervene in the cruelest ways. A narrow trail. In Cedar Grove, Emily spoke to librarians, scoured phone directories, and pored over local archives. David Reed turned out to be a common enough name that she found numerous possibilities. But after cross-referencing approximate birth years and a poetry competition David might have entered, she discovered a local man named David S. Reed who had once owned a small bookstore on Main Street. It had closed down years prior, but a neighbor recalled that he still lived in town, now working part-time at a local printing press. Finding David turned out to be easier than she anticipated once she had the right clues. She found him in a modest white house with a wraparound porch, right on the edge of town. He was in his early 50s now, with graying hair that might once have been deep brown, and lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and regret. When Emily introduced herself and mentioned the name, Helen Summers, David's eyes widened. "Mrs. Summers' granddaughter?" he asked, somewhat stunned. "I haven't heard that name in decades. She was kind to me when I had nowhere else to go." Revealing the letter. Heart-pounding, Emily explained how she'd found a letter in the attic, dated 1986, addressed to Maria Brooks, never mailed. David's expression shifted from surprise to an overwhelming sadness that filled his eyes. He gently held the yellowed letter in his hands, skimming over the words he'd penned so many years ago. "I hid it," he said softly, his voice trembling. "I was afraid her parents might intercept it if I mailed it, and I still needed time to figure out where I'd end up. I thought once I had a stable job in Chicago, I'd send it along with a proper plan." He swallowed hard, lost in memories. But life had other plans. "Maria never responded to my calls. I tried to write, but I never heard back. Eventually, I convinced myself she'd moved on." Emily waited, giving him space to process the surge of old emotions. She then told him what Linda Brooks had shared, the car accident, the move to Michigan, and the heartbreak that followed. David's face reflected a swirl of emotions, relief, pain, and longing all at once. A second chance. Over a cup of coffee, Emily and David talked for hours. He spoke of his regrets, the day he left Willow Bend, the nights he lay awake in motels, rewriting the letter in his head, and the countless times he yearned to drive back and look for Maria. But he never did, haunted by the fear that her family had convinced her he wasn't good enough. Emily proposed the unimaginable. Maria is back in Willow Bend, living alone. I think you should see her. She deserves to read the words you once poured out for her, and maybe, after all these years, you can both find closure, or something even better. At first, David resisted. The fear that Maria might reject him still loomed. But Emily's determination convinced him. He finally agreed, albeit with an unsteady smile, to return to Willow Bend and deliver the letter, this time, in person. The reunion. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when David arrived in Willow Bend. The leaves had begun to change, painting the streets in brilliant shades of orange and gold. Emily had arranged a meeting place at a quiet lakeside park just outside town, hoping the serene setting would calm their nerves. Maria Brooks, now Maria Walters, sat on a wooden bench overlooking the lake. She was in her late 40s, with a gentle grace that age had not diminished. Her hands twitched in her lap, betraying her anxious anticipation. When David approached, she stood slowly, pressing one hand to her chest. For a moment, neither spoke. The tension of 30 years without contact stretched between them. Finally, David produced the old letter from his jacket pocket. I wrote this for you, he began, voice shaking. I never sent it. I thought you'd given up on me. I'm so sorry. Maria's eyes filled with tears as she carefully took the letter. She recognized his handwriting immediately. She read each word in silence, her face reflecting a symphony of emotions, surprise, sorrow, longing. When she finished, she turned to him, tears glistening on her cheeks. If I had only known. I thought you moved on, that you'd decided it wasn't worth fighting for, she whispered. I waited for you to send some sign that you still cared, but I never got anything. Then my parents and the accident, it all happened so fast. David's voice caught in his throat. I tried to call, I tried to write, but every letter was returned, or I never heard back. I figured your family blocked me out. Eventually, I just let fear win. Though tears stained her face, Maria smiled. In that moment, they bridged the gap of decades. They talked for hours, walking along the lake's edge, sharing all the missed moments, jobs, marriages, heartbreaks. Emily watched from a distance, not wanting to intrude on their private exchange, but feeling immense relief that her discovery had led to this reunion. Finding closure. Whether David and Maria would reignite an old flame or simply find closure for the wounds time had never fully healed was anyone's guess. Yet both left that park with lighter hearts than they had carried in years. The letter that once symbolized their lost chance now became a beacon of acceptance. No matter how much time had slipped away, the emotions they once felt were real, and the memories they shared were worth honoring. Later, David thanked Emily for refusing to let the letter's secrets remain hidden. Maria, too, expressed profound gratitude, acknowledging that without Emily's tenacity, she might never have known the truth behind David's silence. Epilogue. In the weeks that followed, David and Maria stayed in touch, sharing conversations that often meandered into fond recollections of youthful dreams, regrets, and distant hopes. They didn't make any grand plans to sail off into the sunset. After all, decades of life experience stood between them. However, they formed a newfound friendship, one built on honesty, understanding, and the knowledge that sometimes love doesn't vanish, it simply waits for the right moment to show itself again. As for Emily, her time in Willow Bend ended on a note of pride and accomplishment. She had helped two people find the answers they'd searched for since they were young. Wrapping up her grandmother's affairs, she gazed around the old White House one last time, feeling a sense of closure not only for Helen's chapter but also for David and Maria's. Driving away from Maplewood Lane, she reflected on the power of an undelivered letter. It had the capacity to alter lives, to reconnect souls separated by misunderstanding and circumstance. She realized that if there was one lesson to take from this remarkable journey, it was that sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is speak your heart, even if years stand in the way. Thus ended the story of a hidden love letter that refused to be silenced by time, proving that there is no expiration date on the hope for reconciliation, and that the deepest regrets can find redemption in the simplest acts of reaching out.